I grew up, for those of you who have heard my story, I grew up in the South. When I was in high school, I was obese, very obese. And I finished high school and I went on to college, eventually went to nursing school, went to graduate, postgrad, all that stuff. And when I was in nursing school, I was introduced to the concept that, maybe we should be eating a little bit differently. Maybe if we ate differently, we might have different health outcomes, kind of like a car. When we buy a car, it comes with an owner's manual, and that owner's manual tells us what kind of fuel to put in it, right? And if we put that kind of fuel in our car, we usually get at least 100,000 miles out of it, right? But if we put water in our gas tank instead of the fuel that the manufacturer requested, we probably wouldn't have an engine that worked for very long, right? Well, my professors were using that as the thought trigger for us to think about, well, maybe the fuel we're putting in our body is having an impact on how we function, just like the fuel we put in our vehicle has an impact on our vehicle's function. And that sort of piqued my interest. And as I entered into my nursing career, I did a few different things, but I ended up on a heart team. And you name it, whatever you do to the heart, we did it. You stop it, you take it out, you put it in, you rewire, whatever. And I noticed that as I was doing this, it seemed to me that when I first started, most of my patients were very much in their elder years. But as I continued my journey in being on a heart team, I noticed that my patients seemed to be getting younger. Well, that kind of freaked me out a little bit because, I don't know about you, but every day I'm getting a little bit older, and I didn't want to one day be on that table. So I thought, well, what could prevent this? And then I got a wild hair and moved to China. And in China, where I taught in the university there, I noticed a variety of interesting things that were very different there compared to here. Obviously the language, but the lifestyle and the diet were very different. So my first day in China, for those of you who've heard this story, pardon me, my first day in China, my first night, this was back in the day where you couldn't fly direct to China from the United States. You ended up in Korea or Japan, or, it took at least 24 to 36 hours to get from here to Beijing. So by the time you got there, you were exhausted. And then the university I was teaching at was halfway between Shanghai and Beijing. So I had to get on a local train and hike it for another 12 hours. So I was just toast when I got there. And that night I collapsed into bed. I don't know, it might have been 2 o'clock in the morning. I don't remember now. But I remember this. Early in the morning, it might have been 3:30 or 4 o'clock. It was dark, I know that. I heard a noise outside my bedroom window, and it was not a noise that was familiar to me. And I thought, oh dear, what's happening? And I was laid there a little frightened. I was 23 or 24, I don't remember. And I crept out of my bed, and I raised the window, and just outside my window, there were probably 20 or 30 older Chinese people doing exercises. This and this, and they got their legs up, and they squatted, and some of them even had swords, and I thought, oh no, what's this? And then I learned they did this every day. They did, gentle exercises, but then they got really serious about it. They did some things I didn't even know if I could do in my early 20s, and I knew my grandma back home couldn't do it. But these were all grandmas and grandpas that were, doing these exercises. And that was my first introduction to, the importance of physical activity as we grow older. I had learned that cognitively in school, but I'd never really seen it. Because all the older people I knew were sick. They had diabetes, they had heart disease, they had high blood pressure, they were obese, whatever. These people were none of those things. And they were, all sorts of exercises. And then obviously they ate differently there, very differently. And that piqued my interest even more. So when I returned to the United States, that's when I began to study clinical preventive medicine and nutrition and that sort of thing, which led me to tofu. It was painful. The first time I had tofu, I honestly thought I would throw up. You know, that is just disgusting stuff. Well, that's because the first time I had tofu, it was made in the United States by someone who had no clue what to do with it. So then when I was living in China amongst, the Han Chinese people, they know what to do with tofu. And when they realized that I didn't eat meat, I was a meat eater before I went to China. But in China, I decided I was going to become a vegetarian because there was no refrigeration back then. And you think about an open air market and all the stuff, I thought, I can't do this. So once they realized that I was a vegetarian, I got all sorts of dinner invitations, and it was grand. And I would always tell them, yes, I'll be happy to come if you let me come early and watch you in the kitchen. And they were gracious. They would let me do that. And that's when I discovered that what they do with tofu there, very different than what we do with tofu here. So when you buy your tofu, 2 rules of thumb. Always organic, okay? Always organic, and always packed in water, right? This kind of package, packed in water, such that when I cut the package open, there's a lot of water and I pour it out, right? It's packed in water. Now you can, in this country, find some tofu, raw tofu, that comes in a little box, right? It's very smooth, but it's not packed in water. I avoid that kind like the plague. It's not traditional tofu, and one of the reasons is it has isolated soy protein in it. Soy got a bad rap a number of years ago related to breast cancer and some prostate cancer because of the estrogen effect. And what they have since discovered is that it's not the soy, it's what we've done to the soy, right? Anytime people have messed with something, they probably messed it up when it comes to food, frankly. So we avoid isolated soy protein because that is associated with some negative health outcomes. Organic soy that is not isolated and all that kind of stuff is not associated with those things. So always organic, always packed in water. The only deviation from that is occasionally you can find organic tofu just like this that has been sliced and baked, or sliced and seasoned and then baked. You don't find that a lot here in the Brunswick area, but you do down in Portland or some of those areas. So for those of you who aren't familiar with tofu, here it is. It's a block of tofu, and we're going to do a couple of different things with it tonight. Now when I pour my water off my tofu, I immediately sit it up on its side just like that. So by sitting it up on its side like that, it helps it to drain out. I always buy extra firm. And the only reason I do that, there is no health reason. The only reason I do that is that the way I use tofu, that is the easiest for me to work with. The extra soft is the type that you normally find in your Asian soups. When you get the soup with the short little handle, that's typically the type. But again, even when I make Asian soup or Mongolian hot pot or something like that, I still use the extra firm. All right. I make a tofu turkey, I still use the extra firm. All right. So that's that. Now, a couple things. When I make tofu egg salad, I do boil the tofu, and that's the only time. And the only reason I do that is because I'm eating it raw, and depending upon how it has been manufactured or how it has been handled, sometimes it's best to raise the temperature of the tofu so that you can make sure, you treat it kind of like meat. You wouldn't eat raw meat, right? I don't always do that. but occasionally I will. I did do that in the tofu egg salad that I made for you tonight. I did not use it raw. I cooked it, just boiled it in water. You put it in a saucepan of boiling water, 3 to 5 minutes, and then you take it out. One thing that will do is the heat of the water will actually drain more liquid out of the tofu. So that once you pour it out of the pan, I've boiled it, now I pour that water off. If I let it sit up in that pan, just how I'm letting it sit up in the container, for whatever reason, it will release even more water, okay? So in fact, for your tofu egg salad tonight, I let it sit up a little too long. I let it release a little more water than I actually would have liked. So your stuff is a little drier tonight than what I like. But anyway, so that's that. Another thing with tofu is if you freeze it, it will change its consistency and it will take on a crumbly consistency much like hamburger. So in China, there are all sorts of plant-based restaurants, and they will make chicken and turkey and fish and all of these things out of tofu, and you would swear you were eating chicken. The consistency, the flavor, all of that, but it's not. It's tofu, and it's related to the heat or the cold that has been applied to it. It will affect the consistency. So if you like hamburger, like in your chili or something, just stick it, when you buy it, don't open it. Don't open it at all. Just stick it right in your freezer. And if I find it on sale, it's a really good sale, I will buy a few extra tubs of it and stick it in my freezer anyway. Not for any specific recipe, but just to have on hand. But if I do that, I would not use frozen tofu in the dishes that I'm using, that we're preparing tonight. The frozen tofu, you would crumble and treat it just like hamburger. So if you cook your hamburger with onions and garlic, well, you would do that with the tofu. If you put it in beans for chili, well, that's what you would do with the tofu. You just simply use your hands and crumble it up, and it has that kind of consistency. So to make our tofu egg salad, what I do, as I said, I typically will boil it. I drain the water off, and then you just use a fork, or I use my grandma's masher, and you just mash it. You'll mash it down. It's really easy to work with. And then what you've got is just little crumbles of tofu. This recipe calls for a teaspoon of onion powder and a teaspoon of garlic powder. It calls for a little salt, and it calls for Vegenaise or the creamy dressing. Now, I included the creamy dressing down here for you. Let me go ahead and add this. This is the onion powder and garlic powder. My garlic powder is sad. And a little salt. This is Himalayan salt. You can use sea salt. I like the Himalayan salt, but it's not required. And then you're just gonna, work that in, stir it up, and then you're gonna add your dressing. Now your dressing can be like a Vegenaise or the creamy dressing that I included the recipe for. To tell you the truth, I never use the creamy dressing because I just don't take time to make it. If I have made it already and I have it on hand, I'll use it. More often than not, I just use Vegenaise, which is like a mayonnaise alternative. So it's not going to have the raw egg or that kind of stuff in it. Let's see, this one is, I don't have my readers. I have hit the age. Water, brown rice syrup, pea protein, sea salt, lemon juice, safflower oil. They have several different ones. This is not something that I would use a lot of, okay? This is something that you use sparingly. It's fat, right? And any kind of processed fat, you want to use it sparingly. If I was really going to be really healthy and really good, I would use the creamy dressing that I've shared with you. Now, I usually add, this says a pinch of turmeric. I try to get as much turmeric into my family as I can, so honestly, I typically use a little bit more than a pinch. It's going to give it a nice yellow appearance. The creamy dressing, like I said, I don't normally make it for this recipe, but I do make this, and I'm going to introduce you to it verbally, only because I left my cashews at home. I'm sorry. So whenever we're talking about nuts in this program, we're talking about the raw nut. Just the good old-fashioned, the way the good Lord grew it, nut, okay? Not something in a blue round can that comes in flavors. All right, so we're talking about raw cashews. Now, for those of you who've been here before, you've heard us say this repeatedly. Sorry, but for those of you who are new, whenever you're working with raw cashews, you always want to wash them. It's the only nut that you have to wash. You don't need to wash almonds or walnuts or hazelnuts or any of the others, but you always want to wash your cashews. There is a oily type substance on the cashew. Cashews are actually in the family of like poison ivy, and there is this substance that can be irritating. I have a friend who owns a cashew plantation down in Honduras, and when they go to harvest the cashews, they look like the old Michelin Man, you know. They have this white suit with these long rubber gloves, only because they don't want to come in contact, you know, for a long period of time with the oils on the raw cashew. Now, does that mean that if you forget to wash your raw cashews that you need to throw away your recipe? No, I have certainly used raw cashews, you know, not washed before I learned, but now that I've learned, I'm always careful to wash them. Another thing with raw cashews is if you will soak them for a little bit in a recipe, say, you know, your recipe calls for cashews in water and other things, I will put the cashews in the water in and go do my other things so that the cashews are sitting there. If they can soak for about 15 minutes or more, it releases in the cashew some beneficial enzymes and nutrients that otherwise aren't available. So you may not have time to soak your cashews, but if you do, if you have time to let them soak for 15 minutes or so. So if I was gonna make this recipe for my tofu egg salad, I would put the cashews and the water in the blender and just let it sit there while I'm working on the tofu and the other stuff. Does that make sense? Okay, so you've got a blender, you've put your cashews in that you've washed, your water calls for 2 teaspoons of lemon juice, a teaspoon of onion powder, garlic powder, salt, and that's it. And you hit the button to just whiz up the cashews. So you're going to blend that until it's creamy. Now, I have finally replaced my, thank you, Vitamix. Couldn't remember the name of it, saved my life. Someone gave me a Vitamix years ago, and I thought, what in the world am I going to do with this thing? It was older than me. It looked like a monstrosity of a something, and I thought I'll never use it, and then I did. And I use it practically every day, and mine finally went kaput. Well, they're really expensive, and I was too cheap to buy another one. So I thought, surely I can get along with a regular, you know, blender, and I did fine. But, you know, it is much easier to go up in life than it is to go back. My mother took pity on me, and she gave me her Vitamix, which she never uses, and I was very grateful. So I do put it in my Vitamix, and it whizzes up very quickly in the Vitamix, you know, 20, 30 seconds, and it's done. In my regular blender, it might take 45 to 60 seconds because I was really cheap and bought a really cheap blender. So, you know, the rule of thumb is just take a spoon and dip it in, and when the spoon comes out, you should see no granules. But if you see any granules there, you need to blend it for a little bit more. You don't want any granules in your creamy dressing. So then what you're going to come up with is this, except it's yellow. So what did I add?
Turmeric.
I added turmeric. Now, that creamy dressing, I literally use more often than anything else as dressing or as a base. This is a base. We call it creamy dressing, but just know that this recipe can be used for a plethora of things. So today I added, it's kind of like Mrs. Dash, but it's not by Mrs. Dash. It's by these people, the Bragg's people. They make something kind of like Mrs. Dash with no salt in it. It's got a bunch of different kinds of seasonings. I added that in there, and it comes out sort of like a ranch dressing. You could add basil or oregano, or you could add anything, whatever you like in your salad dressing. A creamy based salad dressing, like a creamy. You might add a little jalapeno if you like a little zip, or something smoky. However you like your sriracha, however you like your salad dressing, creamy based salad dressings, you can do with this. You can also use this as a sauce. When you heat cashews that have been creamed, like I just described in the blender, when you heat that, if I were to pour this into a saucepan and heat it, it's going to thicken. So this that you're looking at is going to be the cream sauce for the pasta that my family is going to eat tomorrow for lunch. All right? And what am I going to add to it? I'm going to add some mushrooms and some basil. I'm going to pour this into a saucepan, and I'm going to warm it up. It's going to thicken, and it's going to go right over my pasta. Okay? Another thing that you can do with this creamy dressing is if you can use it to make creamy based soups. So let's say you boil 5 or 6 potatoes. You've chopped up your potatoes, you've boiled them, you leave them in your pot in the water, and you pour this in it and you stir it. This is going to thicken it up, and then you're going to have a Dutch potato soup. Okay, now I would add to that some sauteed onion and garlic, because onion and garlic makes everything better, right? But the point is, this liquid that you've created from the water and the cashews and the seasonings, you can use in so many different ways as a sauce over your pasta, as the cream for your cream-based soup, as add some flavorings as your salad dressing, or as your dressing for your tofu egg salad. Does that make sense? So when I made this tonight, or this afternoon, I doubled the recipe, okay? This is exactly doubled the recipe. And this is very, it's very liquidy, all right? Mayonnaise is not liquidy. That's one of the reasons why I don't like it in the tofu egg salad recipe. It's just not quite thick enough for me. If I was going to use this as a mayonnaise alternative, I would decrease the amount of water. In fact, I'd cut the water in half. Okay? Any questions about that? Yes, ma'am?
How long will it store when we have any left over?
Oh, I've kept it up to a week, but I rarely do, because when I make it, I use it in so many different things. I have used it like as a dip for a wrap, or to pour it on a wrap. I have added a wide variety of different kinds. Dill is really good in here. It's going to take on the flavor that you put with it. And you don't even have to, if you're using it like for a cream sauce, you don't even have to use, in fact, I wouldn't probably add the lemon juice. You can, but you don't have to. You can put any flavor with this. It's going to take on it's kind of like tofu. It's going to taste like what you make it taste like. Okay? It really by itself has no flavor. It's going to be flavored how you choose to flavor it. Any questions? Okay. So the last thing that we're going to do is baked tofu. Now, there are 1,000 different ways to bake tofu. I made it for you tonight the way my family likes it. My husband snapped a picture of our grill last summer, and he opened the lid, and every color of the rainbow was there because we were grilling tomatoes and eggplant and, onions and tofu and corn and, you name it. It was in there. It was at all these colors. And he posted it for whatever reason on Facebook. You cannot imagine the number of comments we got about, this grill and how beautiful it was, and we need the recipe. There's no recipe. But when I grill, just so you know, we always grill on a low temperature. But if I were to grill this, like say I want to put it in a marinade sauce, I would take it out of the container. It's going to come like this, right? Take it out of the container, and I just cut it long ways. And so you're making little steaks with whatever flavorings you like. And then you just place it on your grill, and you grill it like you would a steak. I will typically oil the bottom of the pan. In fact, I always oil the bottom of the pan because you can buy today all sorts of mats to decrease the amount of oil that you have to use. They're called sill mats or that sort of thing. They're made out of silicone. I'm allergic to silicone, so I don't use any of that. I use the good old-fashioned oil. But I do use extra virgin cold-pressed olive oil. Extra virgin is the first pressing of the olive, so it's going to have more nutritional content, more nutritional value, right? And it's cold pressed. There has been no heat applied to it, all right? So as long as it's not rancid, then it has not been oxidized. And we're going to talk a little bit about oxidation a little bit later this evening, okay? But you don't want to eat things that are oxidized, so you want to use oil sparingly, and when you use it, you want it to provide as much nutritional value as possible. First pressing of the olive, cold pressed. There's been no heat applied. So I would simply, pour oil on the bottom of my pan, use my hand to work it around, and then I lay my little squares down on the pan. This happens to be liquid aminos. If you use tamari sauce, you could use tamari sauce, soy sauce, that sort of thing. And you just dribble it over. And then I use nutritional yeast. So then I will take a little nutritional yeast and simply sprinkle it on each of the little squares. And that's it. And then I stick it in the oven at 350 for maybe 20 minutes or so, just long enough to bring the temperature of the tofu up and to give those flavors an opportunity to meld.